All right, so we're here with Ish Quiñones. You're a vet tech, right?
Yes, licensed veterinary technician. So it's LVT, So I work with both small practice and a lab animal medicine. That's where the RLAT comes from. But yeah, that's my 9 to 5, as I call it.
Did you say lab animal medicine?
Yeah. So basically, without getting into it too much, like both certified in both sides. So I've worked with both, and this is just like working on the veterinary side of these things, just making sure that things like animals are cared for. Animals are cared for, but that basically they're actually receiving the med. If an animal has surgery, if the animal is actually same thing. I would assess one of my small animal patients. The same thing with these guys. I just make sure that they're happy, healthy, making sure that they're, if they've had surgery, make sure that they've actually gotten their meds, that they're actually non-painful, basically behaving normally, whatever the species may be, or normal for that species.
What and so these are like animals that are being used in like trials and things like that?
Biomedical research, I try not to broadcast too much of that because then I start getting a lot of hate mail. But it's also like people just not understanding what it really is. And just basically, I always use the example of like people like breast cancer treatments. And that's something that just hits near and dear to me because my mother was treated for breast cancer and her treatment would not have been made possible without things like biomedical research. Rats tend to be used for that sort of model just because they're prone to these types of like mammary tumors and so it helps them. So it's understanding that in the perfect world, they probably would not be used, but we don't live in a perfect world. But it's also just a very deep appreciation for these guys, because if it wasn't for them, the treatments that are available today would just simply not be possible. So no matter what people would want to say about that.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a hard pill to swallow, but how many animals have given their lives so that way people could live and survive longer lives. But I mean, how much of our life is that anyway? Even just the food industry, it's in order to live, things have to die, which is horrible.
Yeah, it is horrible. It's like one of those things like one of those sobering thoughts, but it's like, hey, but same thing, it's just like it's one of those really fragile topics that I simply don't bring up often just because of that. It's just a lot of ignorance behind it, and just people just don't quite understand what it is that it entails. So but with that, it's like that's not the only thing I do. I work on the small animal side of things. I do specialize in neurology, anesthesia neurology. So I've had my fair share of dachshunds with, paresis, like basically paralyzed dachshunds who end up needing surgery. Although these days I see more Frenchies than dachshunds. So I can appreciate that breed, but you can't pay me to get a Frenchie. Just because of all these issues. I mean, anything that can't breed on its own naturally. People don't realize that French bulldogs, most of them are born via C-section, and the females are usually artificially inseminated just because of their jacked up conformation. But people don't realize that that's like Mother Nature's way of saying like, hey, cut the shit. Excuse my French.
Yeah.
But that's just like supply and demand type thing. It's like a status symbol.
What about yellow labs? Because I have one.
I love yellow labs. So in veterinary medicine, there's a dark joke that goes around Labradors. They tend to eat silly things. So every time I've been working overnight, like an on-call shift, and whenever we have a Labrador coming in through ER, it's usually because they ate something they shouldn't have. with my colleagues, I usually joke, I'm like, hey, let's, what did this dog eat this time? We've had a dog swallow like an entire Kong, like a red Kong. Don't
Oh
know
my
how
God.
she did it, but she managed to do that. That was fine. One of these standout cases I've seen was like a Labrador who ate 4 pounds of chocolate, like from an Easter basket. She
Oh.
was fine. That one was just like, it was caught early enough that they just gave her apple morphine and she just puked it all up.
Mm.
So yeah, and then another one ate like an entire like pack of bacon. Same thing, puked up. They're fine, but they're sweet dogs. They just really, they sometimes like they're just chow hounds. Like they're garbage. Like they'll get into everything. But I really
Yeah,
like them, and I have an
they're very
appreciation.
dumb.
No, and I have an appreciation for them for because a lot of them are used for like guide dog purposes for like CNI dogs. The ones that fail their CNI training kind of end up going into like they end up being used like narcotic sniffing dogs, or if they're too friendly, like they'll use them, and that's you'll see dogs like that, like Penn Station, New York Penn Station, where they're just like constantly like, scanning, or even at the airport. So they're a very trainable breed. I really like them. I just can't have them because of their size restrictions, but I really
Mm.
do like them.
Yeah, he's a great family pet for us. He's so bonded with the kids and all that, and such a great animal. What is the deal with chocolate? What is it? I mean, what are the big three? Like chocolate, grapes, and pork that you're not supposed to give to dogs?
So, so with the chocolate, it's the theobromine, and basically that's like the It's like think of it as caffeine's first cousin. It tends to cause a lot of issues, and what ends up happening is like same thing as like it would cause with caffeine. It can cause like rapid heart rate and stuff like that. So that's where it comes from. Now, if it's milk chocolate, it's not as big of an issue because it's kind of been diluted out in the way that it's processed. It gets a little sketchy when it's things like baker's chocolates, like that 70% cacao type thing. Like that's where it becomes an issue. But the big dogs tend to fare a little better because they have to eat more of it than something like a 5 pound chihuahua. So
Hmm.
the grapes, I was just having this discussion the other day. It seems to be an American dog thing because out in the Caribbean, you see these stray dogs living out on the streets, like eating everything under the sun, and they're fine.
Hmm.
But the grapes aren't as big of an issue as the raisins are. And again, it's like it has to do with size, like how big's the dog, how much did it get into, and each dog's going to be different. Growing up, we had a pit bull who, great dog, sweetest dog as I've actually ever owned, ate everything under the sun, and the dog was fine. Nowadays, I have one of my Shiba, he looks at something wrong and he's got diarrhea for like 3 days. So it's like, and it's amazing how these things happen. I joke around saying these dogs would not live 3 days on the streets of Puerto Rico if they were these Puerto Rican sockos.
Yeah, well, I mean, even you look at just Americans, you hear so many horror stories about going to other countries and just getting your just guts ripped out by the water or the food or whatever it is, but all the locals are just totally fine.
Yeah, I had that issue when I went to DR. I drank, it was like, I guess it was like tap water, and it just really messed me up for like 3 days after that. I'm like, what the hell? So, and I was ripped. I was basically roasted like a marshmallow by my friends. Like, what the heck? Like, you've been in, this is what happens when you live in the States. Like, yeah, but I'm born and raised in New York, but their
Yeah.
tap water's the cleanest there is. So,
Hell yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it is.
yeah.
So,
So.
were you doing any herping down there?
No, no, no. So basically, the last time I was in DR, I was at a destination wedding. So my best friend got married, and I was in that wedding. So no herping, but I did accidentally find a Dominican boa outside my window at the hotel. So
Oh,
at
wow.
the time, I did not have my camera on. It's like, oh, damn it. So that's always appreciated. It's always appreciated, but eh, no actual herping couldn't be done on that trip. But also, it's like one of those things like with the way everything plays out, I don't get a chance to do it. Now, if I'm going somewhere and I happen to find something, great, but it's not usually my reason to go to these places. Although I'd like to change that in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's something I want to get into. I want to start doing more herping instead of just local. I want to we're going to be going to Washington for our summer vacation, so I'm excited to look around there and hopefully
Ooh,
find something.
that would be pretty cool, actually. So,
Yeah, way out, way out. We're going to be out more on the kind of closer to Spokane, so it'll be more out in nature and more northern. So what kind of animals are, aside from the run of the mill, the dogs and cats, does your work interact with the exotics and reptiles?
so yes. So when I do GP stuff, yes, but it's not as often as I'd like to. And usually, what it's seen is kind of like the more common things, like ball pythons, leopard geckos. You'll occasionally see a carpet, like a jungle carpet python, or what seems like some sort of like coastal diamond integrated that's like kind of been passed off that word, so lineage just been like down the drain. But unfortunately, when I see those things, it's usually for what we call like the common things. It's usually not eating because it's a ball python in the wintertime that's got its mind on other things. And it's usually the female that turns out to be the male.
Hmm.
Um, Respiratory issues like respiratory infections and of course mites.
Mm.
So those kind of like I equate those things to like people bringing their dogs, like, oh, vomiting diarrhea dogs, or just your puppy vaccines, like kind of like your run of the mill cases, but nothing quite as in depth as I would see like in my neurology cases. So,
Mm.
and it's just the way like people treat, not that they treat, it's like the amount of reptile savvy veterinarians are far and few in between. And the amount of people who bring in their reptiles when they actually need an issue, like when they actually need to be seen, is also far and few in between. So yes, some people do bring them in. They mean well. They do everything they can, but that's usually just like what we see. And then of course, like your typical red ear slider that's got like pneumonia from not being kept warm enough, or just kind of like the turtle not eating, you put in the water and it's kind of swimming lopsided, and that's just how we find out it's got pneumonia, some sort of respiratory issue. So those types of things. But
What causes
um,
that?
usually with the turtles, like improper husbandry. Like usually these little turtles, you in New York, you sometimes find them in certain areas where they're selling like those little critter containers.
Mm.
And I remember when I was younger, you'll find them for like 2 for $5, 2 for $10, and they're just kept out. They just kept too cold, and who knows where these things came from. For all I know, they can be field collected or what. It's just improper husbandry, and just like their water, just the way that their water is kept, and just they just tend to get very sick very quickly. And when you're a hatchling and you're kept in those improper conditions, it doesn't take long for you to get that sick. So
Mm.
the times I've had turtles, I've actually ended up with them that way, where they've just been given to me by like a client, and they just like decided to decline treatment, and they end up in my care for about a year or two before I end up moving on to somebody with a pond, because turtles are not something I feel like they just do way better outside in a pond setting, even up in the Northeast. It's very hard to recreate give them what they need in an indoor setting.
Hmm.
Um, it's just like the amount of space that they need as an adult, and just now I won't do it just because of where I live. I live on the top floor, and having that much water on something that can potentially leak and cause a massive issue, it's something that keeps me up at night. So aside from my aquarium, my 2 fish tanks, I just won't bother with anything that requires that much water.
Yeah,
So
for sure. So what is causing the turtle to swim off, to be off kilter if they have pneumonia? Like what causes that symptom?
So without, it's assumed that what happens that their lungs build up with fluid, just like a human would end up with pneumonia.
Hmm.
So just because of that fluid buildup, it causes excess weight, and just like kind of how it'll be off kilter. It's kind of like with people, if you were to take a radiograph if someone's like coughing up a ton of mucus and you get an X-ray of them, you're going to see that congestion on X-ray. So it's assumed that the same thing that actually happened. I say assumed because these are not turtles that I've actually seen radiographs how to confirm. So it's presumed rather that you actually see these things, that it's happening because of this. Um, And usually what ends up happening is that these turtles that present this way, you'll usually hear like a little bit of a wheeze, an expiratory wheeze as they're breathing. So just it's almost like a little, it's like a squeak, like a whistle type thing. And once you put them in water, you kind of see that they're swimming, and you just see that they just kind of lopside on the side. And one of the vets that I worked with when I started out in a career kind of taught me that trick. And usually that's like one of the telltale signs. So if it's subclinical, they may not always show it, but it's just something that I've seen over the years, and it's always usually the same thing, like red ear sliders acquired from these types of things, and just not being kept warm enough, or the water is just kept in a not great shape. Because with turtles, like you have to keep their water chemistry close to pristine as you would with fish, and that's an entirely different art in and of itself. Because anyone who's kept anything aquatic can tell you that the water is, you usually fare better with keeping water chemistry better in a larger body of water than you would in a smaller body of water, just because things like feces, urine can make that chemistry crash very quickly.
Yeah, the solution to pollution is dilution. So yeah,
Yeah, I
more
always say
water
that.
the better.
Exactly. So fish is the same way.
So sorry, I'm curious, how easy is it to treat the pneumonia with the turtles? Is it an easy treatment, and then they
It's
just
an
have to
easy
change
treatment.
their
Usually they
husbandry?
end up needing, usually what ends up happening, if they end up getting something, I'm going to use Fortaz because that seems to be like the one thing that veterinarians love to throw at these things. So Fortaz helps. Usually the way my brain works, if you can culture whatever you're getting out of them, and this is with any animal, if you can culture it and do a culture and sensitivity and see what antibiotic is sensitive, what it's sensitive to, then that would be ideal. And that's just, it's really going to be like, usually it's like Fortaz, Baytro. Um, that's usually like the two standouts. Every once in a while, you'll culture something and you'll get a weird result where sometimes you have to get a little creative with a lot of the medication, just because a lot of what we use in reptile medicine is very, a lot of what we use is very off label. So you sometimes it's like not marketed for dogs and cats. So it's just you have to see what, and every once in a while you'll get something you have to kind of like crush up the pill and just get it into a solution just to kind of get the animal to take it that way.
Mm.
I know of a ball python who actually, for whatever weird reason, she had a respiratory infection that it was resistant to everything except for clindamycin for whatever weird reason, and that's what she was treated with. And she bounced back, but it was just weird because she never got anything, and I mean, she never got any of these other antibiotics, but the strain of bacteria she got was resistant to things like Baytril, Fortaz. So that's just what they ended up treating her with. And I believe that ball python's still like alive and kicking. She's like an older animal. Those things
Oh,
live a
really?
really long time, and I don't know why.
So the culture, when you guys do a culture, is that in house that you're doing that, or is that sent out to a lab? And like,
Mm,
what's the turnaround time for that?
it has to be sent out to a lab. The places I worked at have been too small to do it in house, so it gets sent out to a lab, and it's 7 to 10 days. Usually, if I always find that if we're waiting on those results and we're trying to get it done, like trying to get those results as quickly as possible, it's like watching paint dry, and it takes even longer.
Mm,
It's yeah, but it's usually about 7 to 10 days turnaround time.
okay. What? So how many animals do you have? How many snakes do you have?
Whew. Right now, not, if I'm gonna count my hatchlings,
Sure.
we're probably in the 50 to 60 range.
Okay.
So I was actually, yeah, we're probably like in the 50 range because I had like 30 kicking around, and now I just hatched. Well, no, it's way more than that because I hatched out like 40 hatchlings. So we're up to 70.
Nice.
Yeah, it's I did something very stupid this year, and I of my 6 pairs, 4 of them produced, or 4 of those pairings produced. And of those 4 pairings, I ended up with 40 hatchlings. Now, in retrospect, the 2 other pairs that did not produce, I'm actually happy that did not produce, because I would have probably run out of space.
Mm.
So yeah, I had paired it was a pair of Copwans, or IJs, whatever you want to call them. I think I pulled that male out too soon, and she reabsorbed her follicles. And the same thing with a pair of coasters, as a red coastal, so he's actually Madame Blueberry, so MBB and Russian, and he was paired to a Axanthic tiger, and same thing with her. This male was paired, basically being split up between two females, and I think I just pulled him out way too soon, and she reabsorbed because she was building beautifully. Then I thought she ovulated, and I thought she had a prelay shed, but she was eating. I'm like there's a certain behavior that I look for when they have a prelay shed, and she just wasn't doing it. They tend to start like nest building. I call it nest building, where they just kind of spend a lot of time in the nest box. They're kind of like rooting, like shifting the sphagnum moss around, just kind of like digging their little hole. And
Mm.
she was not doing that. And I'm like, all right, cool. There's always next year. So
Yeah.
yeah. So
So how do you deal with coming home from work after seeing snakes with mites and RIs and all these other horrendous things that, I mean, like how, like my OCD, I would just be panicking that I was going to transfer that to my collection.
so it's they actually bring up a very good question. I do the same thing with if I go to a show. I don't step foot into that room until I shower, and I'm basically change, shower.
Mm.
Those clothes, fortunately, as of late, I've not. The last time I've actually had an actual reptile patient, it's been about 2 years. But
Oh, wow.
yeah, I just, because I tend to not see them. Like if I see them, it's usually as a, I'll have a veterinarian, like I reach out to them, like, hey, do you think you can help out with this? Because a lot of the information that's out there is very limited, and the amount of reptiles. So reptile savvy veterinarians are even fewer and far few in between, just because exotics, they'll sometimes see like pocket pets, they'll see rabbits, stuff like that, but then the reptile vets don't always have python experience. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I say proper python experience, because you'll see a lot of misinformation out there. To this day, you'll still see things like, oh, keep your python at 90 to 92 degrees hotspot. I'm like, no, way too hot. So
Mm.
fortunately, I don't see a lot of those. So I don't worry about it too much, but just the way my mind processes these things, I don't step foot into that room until I've showered and I'm out of those clothes. I don't want to transfer anything. Um, and usually that's like later in the evening anyway. So it works out fine. And the same thing in the morning. And I check that room first in the morning as I'm having my coffee, and I know things are fine. I make sure that I'm a little OCD with things like my thermostat probes, just
Mm.
because you always hear these nightmare stories, like people in their heat tape.
Yeah.
So I like to make sure that these things are actually okay, and I like to make sure that my thermostats are doing what they're supposed to do, and it just makes me feel better. It just helps me sleep at night. So it's just the way that my mind works. And working in surgery, I'm just used to checking things routinely and more than once.
Yeah.
Very type A type of thing. So.
Yeah. I'm the same way. Thermostats scare the shit out of me. They terrify me that the animal's going to lay on it. The probe is going to get moved, and I don't use any. I use timers and dimmers, and I check my temperatures constantly. And I'm going to be getting the Govee temperature sensors so I can actually, look at that. But I keep thinking, like, if I do a thermostat, I want to like epoxy the probe in place or something, or even I don't know how I would want to do that, but I would want to have like a foolproof method set up.
The way I have mine set up in my adult cages, so my adult animals have perching off. So I use 1 inch PVC perching, and I'll kind of space it out like 12 inches across from each other. And because carpets like to drape, they're not perchers in a way that a chondro is going to perch. So
Mm-hmm.
in between those two perches, I end up putting like poultry fencing, like this plastic lattice type thing. And what I'll do is I'll thread the probe in between like the little holes. I'll kind of like zigzag it through. and I'll basically zip tie that in place so it cannot move.
Yeah.
And what I end up doing is I only provide a hotspot of like 85, 86, and that's just to give me just to make sure things don't overheat. I think people just keep their reptiles way too hot, and it works out fine. I do keep cameras in the room, and I've watched my animals when I'm not in the room. And when I've started out with keeping Morelia a long time ago, I was probably say like 2017, 2018. I fell into the trap where I was keeping them a little warmer, and what I've
Mhm.
noticed that they would just never really use that hot spot. So just kind of listening to the animals, like, okay, well, and then just keeping it cooler. And then I stumbled onto the lovely world of NPR, so which is where a lot of my information comes from.
Yeah.
Because like, yes, you have what's published, but then you have the information firsthand of how keepers firsthand keep their animals.
Yeah.
So, and you see enough of that, and it's like, okay, cool. But that's just how I deal with it. With my rack system, I don't keep my temperature probes under the tub. I'll keep it off to the side because what worries me is that moving the tub in and out is going to knock the probe out of place, and I've done that before,
Mm.
and that's why I tend to keep track. Like I watch these things very carefully. I did the very foolish thing where I just kind of like it was one of these 32 quart tubs, where I kind of just pushed it in like a drawer that doesn't close, and I knocked the probe out of place. And I think like within a couple of hours, I noticed that my animals were hugging the cold spot. I'm like, wait, what's going on here? So, and that's where I'm so sorry. And
Oh,
that's
it's all
where
right.
I noticed that this actually happened. So, um, if we can just there we go. So that's how, and that's why I really keep tabs on these things. I'm also very pyrophobic. I Things like a fire actually scares the crap out of me.
Yeah.
I've been through it where the first clinic I worked for actually burned down.
Mm.
So yeah, it wasn't the hospital's fault. It was basically a basement that connected to a basement that belonged to a laundromat, and it was like the dryer that caught fire, and it was all connected. That's how everything happened. Fortunately, it happened on a Saturday, like Saturday or Sunday. There was no one in the hospital. The hospital cat that lived there got treated for smoke inhalation. He was fine. Like he retired and moved on. Moved in with one of our receptionists, and he lived a fruitful life for like many years after that. So that's where the keeping things on check with the fire, being very pyrophobic comes from. So, um, but that's how I do it with the carpets. The diamonds, I do it a little differently. I keep their thermostats turned on and off. I'm a little mean to them. I keep them in my home office, which is where I am right now, and they only get about like maybe this time of year they'll probably get like maybe 10 hours of heat, and then it just
Mm.
turns off completely. And that's powered by like the little Wi-Fi like smart plugs.
Yeah.
So I do keep them.
Yeah, I have those. I have those on all my heating stuff, so that way, if the plan is once I get those temperature sensors in place, I can, if I see something start going weird, I could just turn it off and take care of it when I get home. I'm fortunate enough to work from home uh, often, during the week, so I can constantly be up, checking on things and looking at things, and all my dimmers are inside these cases here, so the dials are all protected and everything. I'm just I hear so many horror stories about thermostats, and it's just it's making me paranoid, and I haven't taken the dive yet.
I use herb stats. I know some people like VE. I don't like VE products. I've had two of those thermostats from VE, and the fuses seem to burn out on them constantly.
Mm.
But the way I go about it is my radiant heat panels are from Pro Heat, so they're combustion proof.
Mm.
Um, so I use those guys, and I'll hook that up in the carpet room. I'll basically hook that up to the herb stat. So, and I basically they only get like 12 hours of heat. Like it'll go on from like 6 a.m. and it'll go turn off at 6 p.m. with a 2-hour ramp time. It's how I do it. And the same thing with the lights. Like the lights are actually connected to the Wi-Fi timers, and it's programmed to turn on and off at sunrise and sunset. But I just keep tabs on I just really keep tabs on these things, especially in the home office where the dogs have access to, dogs knock things over, they move stuff out the way.
Oh
So
yeah. Yeah.
very OCD with that. They're not really allowed in the snake room, so they don't go in there. So I don't worry about that. But I just keep tabs on these things just to make sure that nothing happens.
Yeah. So, how old were you when you got interested in reptiles? When did all that start? Was it?
Ooh. So growing up, there was just my mom always entertained me as a child in a sense that I was always that kid who was always like into pets. I've always had pocket pets, things like hamsters,
Mhm.
and those things are evil. They freaking bite. I cannot. If I had kids and they tell me they want a pocket pet, they're not getting a hamster.
Yeah.
I fell into that trap where I had like 2 hamsters. I ended up with like 20 of them very easily. Reptile wise, I had a nose growing up. Just a Anolis carolensis, like green and nose, and they're like $5 a piece.
Yeah.
Kept them, had the red ear sliders when I would inherit them. My mom drew the line at snakes. Very cultural. It's a very cultural thing. Like snakes are just like the creature of the devil, all this and that. So that was the one thing I could not keep at home. So
Same thing. I went
yeah.
through the same thing as a kid, and I wanted one so bad.
Yeah, I remember in the 90s, I remember seeing before 1997, which is where you would actually be able to find ball pythons in New York City. I would remember seeing them at Petland, and I remember seeing them. They were not cheap at the time. Something like a normal would be like $50, $60. And I remember I wanted one so bad, but my mom was like, no. I'm like, all right, fine. So I couldn't really get into them
Did you have a
until
friend that had one?
I had a few friends that had them. And then of course at the time they were called they had boa constrictors at the time. They would just call them like Colombian red tails,
Yeah.
and I basically seen them, and I remember seeing how cool they were, but seeing how big they were being, how big they're growing. But a lot of these were just overfed and just
Yeah.
morbidly obese. So I didn't really get into snakes until I was older, and it wasn't until like my adult life and my adult department that I took the dive and got my first ball python. And this is like very textbook Craigslist ball python. Unfortunately, she was fine. I had no issues with her, but I learned that ball python just not for me. They're pretty. I can appreciate them for how they're kind of like the gateway animal that people get into herpetoculture sometimes, but it's just a species that's not for me. I find they're not as hardy as people think they are.
Yeah.
Especially things it comes to feeding. Like if you stress them out, they're just gonna stop eating, and they're an animal that's pretty, but they don't always enjoy being handled or just being moved around. It's something as simple as having them in a high traffic area. So, and I feel like carpet pythons are way better for that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I eventually took the plunge into Morelia.
So that was kind of your first pet snake when you got your own place, was the ball
The ball
python?
pythons, yeah. I ended up with a pair. Like they were het albino, and then I ended up moving them on. Like I kept them for a few years. I kind of had a few. I had a few morphs, but then I just remember what I would see a lot was ball pythons coming in to small practice, and it is like just improper husbandry, and just like sometimes, unfortunately, some people kind of treat them as a throwaway animal, where it's like one morph pops up and the previous morph all of a sudden becomes like irrelevant, and the animal gets discarded. I'm like, all right, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I don't like that idea. I don't like that mentality. And I remember just moving on. I started with ball pythons. I dipped my toes into chondros for a while. I realized that they're not a species I want to keep. They're beautiful animals. I can appreciate them, but they seem to have a very narrow range of what basically like the little box of like what makes them happy, and if you stray out that box, they can have issues very quickly. I remember moving into my current home now, and one of my conjurers I had at the time did not like the move and just kind of crashed after that. So I'm like, and that was a very expensive thing to have croak on me. And then the other one I had just did something dumb. I guess after he ate his mouse, ended up getting a piece of cocoa fiber
Mm.
lodged in just that, and I found him dead in a cage
Oh my
the
gosh.
next morning. So yeah, so
How
being
old were they?
they were both these guys were about probably about 2 years old at the time.
Mm.
So and again after that, I'm just like, you know what, I'm not doing this. Chondros just went up in price after that, and they're for what to me, I like them. I really enjoy them, but they're to me, it's like a green snake on a stick that doesn't do much. It just sits there. Like that's why they photograph beautifully, because they're just sitting on the perch. They're just looking
Hmm.
pretty. So I liked them. They weren't for me. Boas I liked, but they just get too big. Not all of them have it, but the whole thing with the arena virus just really freaks me out, especially having pythons. So I'm very careful with stuff like that. I do have Caribbean boas, but those guys were screened very heavily before they moved into my room. And I do have Sonoran boas who live upstairs, and I do keep them away from the collection just in case. Like they've always tested negative, but I don't love the idea of keeping boas of the genus Boa in the same room with pythons. I know people who do it and they're fine with it, but I don't like to do it. That's just my thing. Just because of how, like with IBD, arenavirus, like if they can be asymptomatic. I don't want that to be the reason why I lose my collection or it causing issues with the collection. So I just keep them far away as possible.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I mean, like I said, I'm OCD. That's definitely a fear of mine. I have boas. I love boas. I have two BIs and a BCO, um,
I love these.
the Argentine and just a couple morph boas, and I love them, and I love keeping them, and I do have them in the same room as my pythons, and yeah, there's definitely a little bit of paranoia there, you know.
Nah, I mean, they will do it and they're fine as long as you screen your stuff properly. You'll be okay. But also, it's like with the way my room behaves, I feel like I can keep the carpet pythons and the Caribbean boas in there happy.
Hmm.
So they seem to do really well. My things like my Puerto Rican boas, my Dominican, I can't call them Dominican boas because they're actually Hispaniolan boas because it's Dominican and Haiti, Dominican Republic and Haiti. So I just call them, the whole island is Hispaniola. So I'll keep my Hispaniolas there. Um, Same thing with my Jamaican boa. I have a lone female pet Jamaican boa, and they're kept in the same room. I honestly keep them as I would with my carpet pythons.
Hmm.
They behave just like carpets of the Caribbean. They're like the carpets of the Caribbean. Like their behaviors
Really.
are similar. Yeah. If you can get past the musking, then they're great. Yeah.
I have Timor pythons, bro.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you can keep Timors, then you're fine with that. I actually wanted Timors for a really long time. I kind of still do, but the whole thing of just having urates flung at me is a bit of a turnoff. Um, and just the space they need to do justice for them, I don't think I can do it right now.
Hmm.
I do have appreciation for things like, for my little pythons like free ticks and Timors, but they're just the size requirements and just where I live. I live in a city. Don't I don't want to be the person who ends up on a 10 o'clock news, because you know how this stuff gets like inflated. Like, person keeps 15-foot killer python. I'm like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
See. So it's just like, I don't like to draw this sort of attention to myself. So I feel like with the carpet pythons, they're both impressive and manageable, and they don't get nearly as big as what Gugu says
Yeah.
they do. So they just work out perfectly for.
Yeah, I mean that's why I like the Timors too, because I love the Malayo pythons, but I can't get a retic because I'm in Florida, and they stay a pretty manageable size. I got all mine from Ryan Young, and his adults, his breeders are not they're not, enormous animals. So, and I think he keeps his in 4x2x2s. And
Oh,
I'm, yeah, they're not in,
huh, okay.
and I may stick with 4x2x2, but I might end up expanding their cages as time goes on. We'll see what happens.
Oh,
I'm not gonna, I'm not bulking them up. I have no desire to make them as big as possible. Um, but yeah, I think it's kind of similar. You read it's just like anything. You read about coastals and you're like, well, if I want a 12-foot snake, that's the carpet python for me, you know?
it's funny because like some of these Facebook groups, oh god, I avoid some of them like the plague because it comes a dumpster fire.
Hmm.
It's like, oh, coastals can grow up to this. Like, I think part of the issue is that people are judging this off like the southern coastals that you see in Florida. I think Florida. I'm sorry. Fortunately, not Florida. I meant Australia.
I
Um,
don't know, dude. That'd be pretty damn cool.
I don't know. Fortunately, no. It would break my heart because like I love
It would
like
be terrible. It would
it
be
would be
terrible.
terrible. But like you see, like the southern coastals in Australia, and some of them like eat, people's pet like guinea pigs and stuff like that. And I think those guys do get a hefty size, but I think the reason why they get to be those sizes, that's just like they're not competing with things like scrubs, like the way
Hmm.
that jungles would compete with them. So I think that's why they're able to get bigger. But right now, I have the oldest coastal in my collection right now is a 12-year-old female who's actually on breeding loan from Eric Hernandez, and she's probably maybe 6.5 feet.
Hmm.
She's not a large animal, so I don't, and she's not. And the largest thing I'll ever give her is a medium rat, and you hold her, she's very muscular. She's not fat and obese, but she's an impressive animal. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, they don't get as big as people think they do, unless you're feeding them things like rabbits, which is a crappy idea.
Yeah.
You feed them normally, they're not going to get as big as people think they do.
Yeah. I think if you want a big snake, go for it and feed it chickens and rabbits and little piglets and stuff like that. And yeah, you're going to get yourself a big snake.
Yeah, but is that snake going to really live a long time after that?
No, of course not.
So
you know?
I know, and I think the overfeeding thing, I think it's just like people, we're deep in America, we're deeply ingrained, like food equals love. And that's not just America, it's just like American pets. Because, like, how many dogs and cats have you seen who are a little on the pudgy side? And I
Hmm.
think we're just so conditioned to seeing overweight animals that when you see an animal that's actually of accurate size, it's like, oh my God, your dog is skinny. I can see its ribs. Like, no, that's its waist you're looking at. They should have a
Hmm.
waist. They shouldn't like a big old square. Like, oh, so and I've gotten that every once in a while because of my dogs. People are like, oh my God, they're so skinny. I'm like, they're not skinny. You're looking at their waists. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's our yellow lab. We feed him a very strict diet, and he's the healthiest dog I know. It's you want him to have a nice taper at his waist and have an athletic build, and it's going to equal longevity. So it's the opposite. Excessive food equals the opposite of love. It's not good for the animal.
same thing with us. We eat and like, man, so every once in a while I've gained weight like after the holidays, and I can feel it after a certain point. I'm like, wait a second. Like, I can actually start feeling it in my knees. Like, oh, wait, hang on. I'm not a big guy. I'm only about 155 pounds. I got up to 160 at one point, and I started feeling it. I'm like, holy crap. And then
Yeah.
I lost that weight quickly. So it's just, that's how it is. I don't know what is it. Like, that people like people just, and I think sometimes people just like mistake food for love, food equals love type of thing, and here you go eat, so
Hmm.
that's how.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about the forums and the Facebook groups, and there's so many newer keepers that think that their snake should be eating once a week the same way that their dog eats, once or twice a day, or and then you'll see pictures of their. I won't name any names, but I actually saw this where the person is trying to feed it and it's laying. It was a python. I won't get into specifics, but it was laying on a comforter that they're trying to feed it on. So they've taken it out of an area where it feels comfortable in broad daylight, put it down on a bed, and they're trying to feed it on the bed. and they're like holding it, and I'm just like, what are you doing? This is the opposite of everything you should be doing. And why are you obsessing about it if it ate 6 days ago? It
I
just ate.
I think I know which post you're talking about. I've seen. I'm like, okay, there's like few things wrong with that. Number one, you're feeding it on the freaking bed. Like, if anyone who's kept a snake for any amount of time, like you, sometimes they grab them. They're so overzealous about it that it actually explodes.
Mm-hmm.
And to have something like that happen on my comforts, no, like I'm
Yeah.
not doing that. It's just like also like that's the perfect way to get bitten. It's like I
Yeah.
don't know where this whole thing of moving animals for feeding came from. It's like it's not, or rather, I get where it comes from, but why is it still a thing? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
People swear that it just makes them aggressive, like feeding them in the enclosure makes them aggressive. Like no, but I just I won't do it. Obviously, it's not feasible in my collection. It's also a really crummy idea, but I tap train my animals. Like I'll feed them, and if I need to get them out, I'm not one to. I don't need to handle them. I just need to work around my animals.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd rather let them do their thing. But if I have to reach into their cage for whatever reason, they have been conditioned, just kind of a little tap on the nose with the hook, and it kind of turns off their feed response. Usually, I have one
Mm-hmm.
who thinks she's a Woma, another animal on breeding loan. I love her dearly, but she's one of my, I call her a FAFO animal. Fuck around and find out. Because she's not aggressive, but she does not, that food response does not turn off, like ever. Um, to the point where when she had a pre-lay shed, I accidentally thought I had an extra day-old chick lying around. I just gave it to her. She took it, and for a minute, I actually questioned if she was actually gravid, but she ended up going on to laying a clutch of 11 eggs.
Mm.
That's the clutch that just hatched out recently. So that's a
Nice.
fuego. Yeah.
I love when they have a really strong feed response. I like it, if I go in the cage and they're keyed in on me, I love that because it is a good feeling to know that you have an animal that's going to eat. And it is a terrible feeling when you have animals that don't want to eat. And when it's been weeks and you're trying to figure out what is going on here and what is going to be agreeable with this animal to get them to eat consistently. So I know that, when it's time to feed, they'll feed. But then you see these people that are obsessing over it in this really unhealthy way, and it's a totally different thing where it's like you don't have an animal with a problem, you're creating a problem.
Yes.
And that same person that I saw post that, like 8 hours later, has their animal outside, and they're doing like, oh, it's exercise time, and it's like, you need help. You legitimately need help from you. You need snake friends. That's what you need. You need snake friends.
Yeah, a mentor is a very good thing to have, especially if you're getting into like if you're considering breeding them. I have fortunately my mentor, who's I would actually he's a buddy. Eric Hernandez is where most of my reds come from. All but two of my reds are from him, and he is a friend of mine. But I would say he's also my mentor. Just like it's very different to see like firsthand keeper experience versus what I would say is things like the what is it? The name, like the Melissa Kaplan website of like how to keep your snake. That's where a lot of this misinformation comes from.
Yeah.
It just and it helps a lot. And also, it's like if anyone, all these keepers will have at the very least, I'm going to say 50, but a lot of these keepers have more than 50 animals in their collection. It's a good sample size to see like, okay, what do these animals like? And it seems to be like 80, 82, 88, like 83. Like it's what these animals like. That's all they really need.
Mm-hmm.
So, and a good night drop helps. I think people just keep their things just way too hot. And,
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a tangent.
No, it's fine. So what made you go towards the vet pathway and animal care and husbandry and everything?
It's something I've always wanted to do. Once upon a time, I actually wanted to become a veterinarian. My younger self wanted to become a veterinarian. I've quickly got that idea out my head just because the amount of schooling that's involved and just the amount of debt that you're going to end up in after that, it's not something I really want to do. Not definitely not now. I'm 41. It's not something I want to do. Um, and just basically what the pay is like, just the amount of hours that people work, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
Don't want to do it. So I ended up going the licensed vet tech route, which was the equivalent to RN. I don't want to work with humans. Human vomit grosses me out. Humans gross me out, but human vomit specifically, really, I can't deal with it.
Humans are
Um,
disgusting.
yeah, it's like I can now if someone has a broken limb and their bones like sticking out their skin, like that does not make me wince. But hearing someone vomit is enough to like make me turn my head. I'm like, all right, I'm gonna pat them from like 6 feet away with a broom, like they're there.
Yeah.
So can't do it. So I started out as a unlicensed assistant, basically bottom of the food chain, so to speak, like cleaning out cages and just like helping restrain pets. And this very same clinic was the same clinic that burned down like several years later. And it left me unemployed for 14 months. And after that, I was like, during that time, like, you know what? I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to get my license. There's no reason why I should be running around without a license. And that was the route I took. What I wanted to do after that, I just decided that I wanted to become specialized in a few things. I decided to go both the small animal route and the lab animal route, just to kind of, I say, for job security purposes. And that's exactly what I did. Graduated from LaGuardia College. I actually graduated like 2013, got licensed. Ended up working in one of the emergency hospitals for a while. Basically started out in internal medicine, did not like it. I really did not like internal medicine. And I ended up in neurology. And I learned that I really like dealing with things of the brain and spine.
What did you not like about the internal medicine?
Well, first and foremost, it was the environment I was in. That particular hospital, it was basically, the staff was a little toxic, very condescending, very just. It was not a very nurturing environment. And you see a lot of that everywhere. Like there's always going to be that toxicity to an extent in any field you work in. But it was just a roll of the dice. I just worked with just in case that someone actually listens to this, who I know, it was just a not great. Just the vet was great, but like I say, like mannerisms were not always great, and the staff working with that vet were equally as bad.
Hmm.
So I ended up having to get transferred into same hospital, different location, different borough, and I ended up fitting right in with the neurology team, and just kind of really took off that way. And I kind of really learned that I've really enjoyed dealing with these things and spending a lot of time in MRI and CT scans and just a lot of the anesthesia experiences. That's hospital is where I got it from. And I think just being on call and just working these emergency shifts, it really helps with reaction time, to the point where now in surgery, if there's a actual legitimate emergency, I just like to keep things as calm as possible, which is a little bit of a contrast to my personality outside of the OR. Because anyone who knows me, I can be a little high strung at times, but in the OR, for some reason, I'm really able to turn that off, and I don't know why. But I think part of it is that if you get high strung in the OR, you're more likely to panic, and that's just like a chain of events. Then people around you are going to start getting a little high strung, and that's when people start panicking, that's when accidents happen, and that's when like your judgments like shrouded. I just clouded over. I don't like that. I don't like working that way. So
Hmm.
I try to turn that off, especially in the OR. But that's where I learned that I really liked anesthesia. And it just over time, just dealing with these cases and on calls and just on call shifts and patients actively trying to die in the OR, just it helps with keeping your cool when things are not quite at that level. And it's something I really enjoy. If it was left up to me, I'd be in surgery all day, every day. Because if I'm in surgery, then I don't deal with the general public, and that can
Hmm.
be exhausting. I don't find myself to be a people person. Um, I'm very much, I'm going to say Shiba Inu just because that's the breed of dogs I have. Once you get to know me, I'm fine. I'm outgoing. Like but when it comes to like people I don't know, I tend to keep myself a little on the reserve side, and having to deal with that and having to deal with just having like put on your poker face when dealing with the general public and their dogs and stuff like that. It's that gets tiring. So I prefer to be in the OR where I'm limited to that sort of exposure. I just deal with whoever's in the OR at that moment in time.
Yeah, I get that. I really identify with that. I'm the same way. If I'm in the middle of chaos and things going wrong, I feel more at peace. And then when things are peaceful, I'm more anxious. Like I'm waiting for the chaos. You know, it's a bizarre thing.
Yeah, and it's like I think when so in the OR, I have a reputation for just like I've kind of barred people from panicking from going into the OR just because it's not good. Panic in the OR is probably one of the most. It's a very detrimental thing, and it's just if people. I always this is why I always recommend to my young techs, my young vet techs, like if you're able to spend a year in emergency, like you may not want to be what you want to do long term, but spend a year working emergency to help with your reaction time and to help kind of deal with those stressful situations when you have a patient that's being triaged to treatment where it's like someone in respiratory stress, something that's unstable on the verge of dying. It helps with these things when things are not when things are stable and they're going to be fine. Because sometimes, like in the OR, it can be something what some people perceive as an emergency is not quite an emergency. Sometimes it can be something as simple as like equipment just not doing what the equipment is supposed to do. Your monitor can, decide it's going to malfunction and it's giving you weird heart rate readings when you get your hands on that patient and you actually assess manually and like, wait a second, this isn't matching the manual. So it's like learning how to deal with that and just learning that your eyes and ears are going to be your other senses are going to be first and foremost. The monitors are always going to be like secondary. Like people rely on it too much and they tend to freak out, and it's just not something that I recommend. If I'm getting a weird reading over something, I'm gonna check this patient first before I start sounding the alarm. So
Yeah.
that's how I always look at it.
So how much schooling was it to get to become a licensed vet tech?
So this is actually a community college. So this was a 2-year program. There's 4-year programs, but honestly, a licensed vet tech who has an associate's versus one who has a bachelor's, it doesn't really the pay doesn't really do much because you're not looking at that degree. Like it helps in certain situations, but so does experience. What they're really looking at is whether or not you're licensed or not and what state you're licensed in. Some states don't require you to be licensed. Some states do. Places like California, their licensing requirements are very strict. Then you have places, I believe Florida and Georgia are 2 states that you don't need to be licensed. New Jersey is another one, but there's a good deal of licensed vet techs who are licensed in the state of New York working in Jersey.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's where that comes from. Yeah, and that's an entirely different debate. That's like a very old debate, licensed versus non-licensed. Is it licensing worth it, or non-licensed personnel, really that much worse than licensed personnel? It all becomes it ultimately comes down to schooling and experience. And I think one of the most toxic things is like complacency and like people thinking that they know it all, which is that can be said for anything ever.
Hmm.
And I think that's where it really comes from. I've worked with people who are non-licensed who swear they know everything, and while they do have the experience to back them up, but that mentality is what's really detrimental because a person who thinks they know everything is not going to learn something new. And things like medicine changes very routinely, and you have to be okay with like learning new things, like with new anesthetic protocols. What's current, what's outdated, what's downright antiquated.
Hmm.
So you just have to, and that's where CE or continuing education comes in, where we have to have certain amount of hours for our license renewal, and a lot of basically you're learning on your time off. But I always say a good technician never stops learning. But in my case, it was the 2-year route.
Nice. And then once you got that 2 year, then you were able to go into more specialized things, get into the neurological side, and
So what ended up happening is that where I did my internship at Blue Pearl Veterinary Specialist, and so I basically did my internship at the Midtown location. And when my internship was up, I was offered a job, but they didn't have space for me at the Midtown location, so I got sent to one of the outer boroughs. And I was there for like maybe 3 months before they transferred me back into Midtown. I spent a lot of time in surgery during my externship, and that's how I've really like picked up the pace with things. You kind of learn to deal with that pressure, and they moved me into neurology, and that actually worked out really well because it was slightly change. I'll just say there's an asterisk. There's an asterisk in that because it's like fast paced, but it wasn't to the point like with surgery. With the surgical department where it's like constant and it's like you eat when you can. But we did have our moments where sometimes you'll have like a quiet day where you just have a few appointments and maybe an MRI, which is like considered an easier day, versus having 3 dogs coming in that are paralyzed who need an
mm,
MRI and surgery, which is like there goes your entire day. In fact, there goes your day, and you're probably not gonna leave until very well after midnight.
wow,
That can easily turn into a 12-hour, 13-hour day. So 16 hours if it's a really shitty day. So that
yeah,
does not count my on-calls. I was on call overnight every 10 days, and there was times that I can leave for work Monday morning and not come back from work until like Tuesday night.
wow,
Because I'll work my normal shift, then I'm on call from like 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And for some weird reason, when I was on call, I would always have difficult cases coming in and then having to work your normal shift after that, which is, it leaves you kind of like on zombie mode after that. So
So
that's,
is that all overtime, or are you getting like, do they give you
oh
like
yeah,
an extra
that's,
day off, or?
overtime. My neurologist was very, he was a very easy, very straight, very easy neurologist to work with. He would see that if we're looking a little rough around the edges, you're like, look, just go home. Like, we'll be fine. Like, send us home early, as long as it wasn't an absolute shit show. But honestly, working that long, you kind of become on auto. You kind of go into autopilot, and you tend to not realize how tired you are until you sit down.
Mm,
And that's when you kind of, I'm gonna close my eyes for 5 minutes, and that's where it gets, that's that dreaded, like you wake up like 2 hours later type thing. So
wow.
yeah, it's
So
exhausting.
are you working in New York or Jersey?
Right now, I'm in New York. I'm born and raised in New York. I still work in New York. Where I'm at is like I can get into the city very quickly.
Hmm.
So I'm far enough from the city to get away from the bullshit from the city, but I'm also close enough that I can get to work in a decent amount of time. And then, of course, like the whole reptile thing, like New York City is not a city that's very reptile friendly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's something that is very newsworthy very quickly.
Yeah. So
That can,
what kind of laws are you dealing with where you're at now with snakes, or are there not very many?
so you can't keep native things. Well, let me rephrase that. There are some native species you can keep. We can't keep corn snakes here.
What?
Because we do have, yeah, they're an endangered species. Anything that's going to be in an endangered species list, we can't have in Jersey. So corn snakes are not something you can keep. Um, but it may, well, when I say corn snakes, you can keep red-eyed albinos, but it can only be a red-eyed albino. It
Oh,
cannot be like
wow.
some sort of morph that we as reptile keepers know it's clearly captive born and bred.
Hmm.
But people who are not reptile savvy, like they can't, what they worry about is like people collecting from the wild. So that's like, just to make it easy to deal with it, you say nothing unless it's a red-eyed albino. So
Mm.
I would have really liked to have a nice pair of like Okatee corns, but that's not going to happen in Jersey.
Yeah.
I kept rat snakes for a short amount of time. My they don't like my snake room. It gets too warm in the summertime. They don't like it anywhere over 82, 83. So I just don't keep them. And I can appreciate them, but they eat shit all the time, man. It's just like colubrids. It's like you have to feed them constantly. It's like pythons are very convenient. When I've had my colleagues like, oh, why do you get into pythons? Why this? Why that? Why don't you get into something else? Like, they're a very convenient pet to keep. I don't need to walk them. I don't need to feed them frequently, and they don't shit all the time.
Yeah.
So, once in a while, I have one do something dumb like shit on the glass of the cage, and just decide to smear it, especially after it's eaten like a freaking like some sort of poultry item, where for
Nasty.
some reason it can have like runny stools.
Yeah.
Yeah, but whatever, you roll with that. It's no different than dealing with a dog that ate something horrible, and you have to deal with those consequences. So,
Yeah.
but that's where it comes from. That's pretty much the extent. Is like, as long as it's not on an endangered species list, and you're fine. Things like anacondas are prohibited species. Free ticks you can keep, but it's like with a lot of the python species, you need a permit. It's one of those things. It's an annoying situation because if you have boas, you don't need a permit for them.
Huh.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
So, and then with geckos, technically speaking, you're only allowed to keep like tokays without a permit. A lot of these
What?
yeah,
That's
and
so
tokays is
crazy.
like the freaking bitiest of the bitey species you can actually get. So,
Yeah. What do you have any, do you keep any lizards?
no, I've tried keeping gorgo geckos a couple of years ago, and same thing. They didn't like the room. It gets too hot in the summertime. I've noticed that room can actually hit 82, 83 easy just because of the way the west facing window hits. And I've since dealt with that window. I've covered it so it minimizes the heat that hits that room. But things with legs it's not my thing. I wanted to get Kimberly rock monitors at one point, but honestly, anything that's insectivorous, anything that eats, like anything that requires you to keep a dubia or roach colony is an absolute no for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be the guy who would knock the bin over by mistake, and I don't do insects. So I'll probably have to burn down my home after that. So
Your house would be the colony.
yeah, I'm like, no, we're not doing that. Like, so I don't want to be that person. And just like, I don't know if it's a New Yorker in me, but insects just really skeeve me the fuck out. To the
Yeah.
point where like my dogs, I just keep them on flea and tick preventative, so year round, so I don't have to deal with that headache. So
Sure.
nothing, and just like what they need, especially things like monitors, what they need, like the excess heat. I don't think I can actually keep that in my room without letting the room get too hot. So, knowing how this room behaves, I just like to keep it as it is. So,
How do you use substrate or paper?
so good question. Anything that's not in quarantine and that's not like fresh out the egg is kept on cocoa mulch. So it's like I use gaps right now, and that works out beautifully.
I use gaps too. I like them.
I like them a lot. I've tried what is it? I think it's like Grow It. I've tried other coconut mulches, and I don't always like it. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
it just like mostly fiber, and it's not something I deal with. That's actually one of the issues I had. It was a different brand that I had the issue with when I had the Conjure that just made that poor choice and ended up passing away. So I just use gaps. Now with the freshly hatched stuff, they're all on paper towels just because it's easier to keep tabs on if they're eating, if they're passing stools, stuff like that. Things in quarantine, I keep them on paper as long as I know that they're not mite infested. And then once I know that they don't have mites, I'll switch them over to coconut mulch. Just
How
because
long is that period for you to make sure that they don't have mites or anything?
it can be anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks. I'm pretty mean with my quarantine, and I would dare say I'm probably excessive with my quarantine because I swab everything that comes in. I don't care where it comes from. So everything gets swabbed for nidovirus, like my screening. So like nidovirus, arenavirus, stuff like that. Everything gets swabbed. It goes into quarantine. It stays there for at least 90 days. And before it gets released from quarantine, it has to get swabbed again. And it has to pass that test. In terms of treating everything like preventatively, I use basically is like the equivalent of like preventamite. So anything that's like a permethrin based spray, I'll use that, but let it dry out for 24 to 48 hours. Because that stuff requires a lot of ventilation, then everything goes in that.
Mm.
And that's basically how I make sure that nothing comes in and nothing, like if there's going to be a mite issue, it's limited to the quarantine space. But fortunately, knock on wood, I haven't had to deal with that in a long time. The last time I've actually had mites was after one of the reptile shows, and it didn't get past the quarantine rack, but I don't think it was from the animal that I got. I think it was just from the environment, but it was nipped in the bud very quickly, and that's what caused me to switch up how I deal with the quarantine.
Mm.
I know people like to keep things in that naturalistic setups and whatnot. I can appreciate it, but even in the main collection, I'm probably not going to do that because I need to be able to break everything down and sterilize it if I have to. And you can't
Yeah.
really do these things with a naturalistic setup. And bioactive is not going to work, not for what I keep, and not for
Not
how
for
I
the
keep things.
scale. Yeah.
No.
I was going to ask if you do any of the isopods and springtails and anything like that, but I think you already answered the question with you don't like bugs.
No, you know what? And also, like that requires that. That's very much like keeping like an aquarium setup, where it's like you have to deal with an ecosystem, so to speak. And
Hmm.
I can't. I know people try it with large things, with like pythons, and it doesn't work. I've tried keeping things as simple as pothos in my adult carpet python caging, and all the pothos it's died because they get trampled by the carpets,
Yeah.
especially my larger females. They seem to love to sit in that pot, and the plant dies and it's the plant dies a miserable death. It's pothos. If I take it out and water it, it's going to be fine. It bounces back, but I just learned just to go with the artificial route with those guys. And the artificial is just, it's probably more for me than for them because they probably don't care.
Yeah.
They have their hides, they have everything they need. It's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing to have these artificial plants in the cage with it. These are just like the adult cages. I don't do it
Yeah.
in racks.
Yeah, I do like a kind of a hybrid approach. I do the gaps cocoa and I forgot what kind of springtail it is. I'm not into all the bugs and what they are. I just like having them in there. So if there's a little mold bloom, the springtails seem to knock it right down. And if I would never expect that cleanup crew to clean up like a snake stool, obviously, with the size animals that I'm keeping with the boas and pythons. But
Yeah.
if I spot clean, they live in that area and they're breaking everything down. I mean, it's pretty wild, and it's kind of fun too because all my cages have isopods in them. So if I flip over some cork bark, I'll find them under there, and it's neat seeing like a baby go by and know that they're breeding and things like that. And then, like you said, I do all artificial plants because I tried live stuff, and it, like you said, it seems like they like rubbing on it or something, and they just crush it. And I've actually noticed I added these kind of like palm looking things that I got from Hobby Lobby, and I did a plaster of Paris base on it to keep it really weighted down. And the Timors absolutely love those. They go under the fronds and they just lay there and watch. And, in their mind, they're totally concealed. And then I can actually observe them. And it seems like it's really calmed them down having those palms in there.
I think with the more high strung species and even like high strung individuals,
Hmm.
I think that having the artificial cover does help them feel secure. I've had over the years like a few higher strung animals who for some reason don't do well. And when I say don't do well, I mean like they're like a fussy feeder, or
Hmm.
I look at them the wrong way and they'll just stop feeding. And I find that if I keep those animals in the caging with adequate cover, and if I keep them in the top cages, I'm only 5'6", so I can't look into the top cages in my room. They seem to really do well in that setup. So fortunately, as of right now, those animals have actually gotten used to my presence and to the point where they're just fine. because those females that I've had in the upper cages, I've moved them lower because I don't want to keep an adult female in a cage I can't see or reach into, because I've been bitten on the top of the head by an animal, and it wasn't even a large animal, and I was like, holy shit, like that hurt more than it freaking tickled. So I've kind of learned that my males, all except for one, are in the top cages. Just it's easier to get a male out of those cages than an adult female, and just with the temperature regulation and just how getting the information that I have from the Govee, the thermometers, or the thermometer recorders, whatever you want to call them, I learned
Yeah.
that those cages get a little warmer than everything else, just how heat rises. So I just learned to keep my females lower, and just again, I just learned how that room behaves. So, but I do keep the artificial covering. It does help a lot. I had a civil python who was an absolute demon. I mean, now she's someone else's problem. She's still a demon. But she was giving me issues in quarantine where she wasn't a reliable feeder just because of where it was at. And once I moved her into the main room after she cleared quarantine and I got her feeding consistently, she needed like the artificial coverage. She did well. But I've also learned that liasis is not a species that I want to keep. I might give it another shot years from now, but as of right now, I just call them liasses because they're not for me. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
if you want them to be marginally okay with being held, it seems like it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, and it's like again, like I don't need to hold my snakes.
Yeah.
They're pretty. I don't need them to be puppy dog tame. I have my dogs to be tame. Like it's a species. Like I prefer my snakes to behave like snakes. I don't
Yeah.
mind if I have a few animals that are look but don't touch, and they're fine. I don't need to handle them. And I'm totally fine with that. People who know me and know that collection, they know which animals not to mess with. Like they're like, no, no, don't touch him. Like he's gonna bite
Yeah.
you. He's gonna ask questions after that. So, but I do have other animals. Like if someone wants to get their exposure to pythons and they kind of want to get over that fear, there's a few animals that I'll let them hold versus some animals like I'm probably not gonna let them hold that animal because it's gonna bite and rap because that animal's like on food mode constantly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I have two kids and they always want to hold the boas, I think, because the boas are a little bit more laid back and tranquil. But if we come in the snake room at 8 o'clock at night, those boas are in a different mood.
Yeah,
It's a different, especially if it's been a week or two, or I should say 2 or 3 weeks since they've eaten. They're pretty keyed in on movement and everything. And it's like, yeah, we gotta, it's you can't just stick your hand in and grab them. And no snake, it's because yeah, especially after it's been a little while, then they're ready to eat.
yeah, I've made it a point never to do husbandry after lights off. Even
Yeah.
my most reactive animals, like I can work around them. If they're in their hide box, their human hide slash nest box. If for some reason I need to clean out the entire cage, I'll just move them out in the box and just get them out the way, just so keep them honest. Or if they're in a sky hide, I'll just work on the opposite end. And I just know like I'll sometimes go in, I'll peek my head at night just to see what's going on. If there's an animal I haven't seen in a couple of
Hmm.
days, I'll just make sure that, okay, like, is this animal in shed? Is this animal just actually out and about? And I've actually done it. Or if I really feel that this animal, I've had one, for some reason, I've had it happen with jungles years ago where I would never see them. And the only time I actually saw them was when I actually turned on the camera and I see what they were doing. And it was
Yeah.
usually just very high strung animals. So I don't mess with things like that. Like I don't, if I don't need to, unless I really like something horrible happens where they knock over the water bowl in the middle of winter and that room gets cold at night, then I'm like, okay, wait, we got to deal with this like right away. Because the way I cool that room down and having something get wet and cold is not an ideal situation. So that's the only time, like that's the exception, but not the rule.
Yeah. So do you keep any animals on like ambient, or do you provide a hotspot for everything?
Everything has a hotspot. The only thing I've ever kept on ambient over the summertime were my rat snakes when I had them, and that was before I moved them on. But everything gets a hotspot. So what I'll do is they'll get a hotspot of 85, 86 in the cages. With the racks, I set everything up to 88, but if I were to take a temp gun and actually record the hotspot, it's going to only reach like 85, 86.
And
So
that's for your boas as well?
that's for the boas as well. Yeah. So with the Caribbean boas, what I do is I have them towards the window in that snake room where it get a little warmer. They're fine with it. They probably, those are the only animals that actually enjoy the extra heat when they do get it. But I've noticed that when I've had my carpet pythons in that corner, um, if I go into that room at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a during the summertime, they're all up against the cold end of the cage,
Mm,
or they're not soaking, but they're perched on the water bowl where they're kind of dipping half their body into the
yeah.
water bowl, and I'm like, all right, wait, got to get you guys out of here. So, and I ultimately learned to use like one of those like window films that kind of block out some of the sun, and I have Venetian blinds that actually, if I need to adjust it just to kind of block that area from getting warmer than like 83, 84, then I can do that. But everything is provided with hotspots. Um, and then the way that room behaves, like those hotspots I don't mess with at all. Like during the year, like I don't swap it up. Like they get those hotspots year round, and they just in the wintertime. I'm probably going ahead of myself, but I let that room get. I don't do anything special with that room. So
Okay.
yeah,
So your hotspot is 85, 86. What's your cool side at? Or does it just vary?
the cool spot's gonna vary the time of year. So in during this time of year, if it's late at night, it'll probably get down to like 78, 79. Summertime, it'll be a little warm. I've seen it high as like 79, 80. But I watch my animals carefully. They don't
Hmm.
seem stressed, so I just leave it alone. I think letting them experience those temperature swings is a little bit more beneficial, as long as it's not get past 84 and I'm fine. And I keep tabs on my temperatures with the Govee thermometers.
Hmm.
What I like about them is I can actually keep track of the trends over 24 hours and see what happens. Because what I'm seeing when I go into the room, what I'm seeing is only what I'm seeing at that moment.
Sure.
But animals do different things when you're not in the room and when you're not staring at them. So that's just how I manage things. The cool spot in the summer, I rarely worry about it. I'll probably keep tabs on it in the winter time, but I do let that room get very cold in the winter, like colder than what some people do. I let it drop to 67. And the way to
Nice.
prevent it from dropping even further is just I keep a oil filled heater that only turns on if the temperature drops below 67. The
Okay.
diamonds I'm mean to. The diamonds, I crack that window open in the wintertime, and this room would get to be like 45, 50, depending on the time of year.
Wow.
So, now, if I'm
That's
in a
wild.
room and I'm shivering with a hoodie on, then I know the diamonds are fine.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Um, so I was just going to ask about the cycling temperatures. Do you cycle year round, or is it only during the winter? Like, are there temperatures dropping at night? Or is that only the diamonds that you're doing the temperature drops?
Everyone gets a temperature drop the minute, like even the little guys who hatched out this year, like they'll experience some temperature swing in the nighttime. Um, even my hatchlings that I get in, like they all experience that temperature swing. I believe that getting them used to it early on is better than kind of getting them dialed in later on in life.
Hmm.
Now, my approach to the little guys is I keep that rack closest by the door to the room where that side of the room gets a little warmer. So in the wintertime, even at nighttime, their temperature is probably going to be no lower than like 72, 73. But I do treat them like my adults. Like I won't feed them in the wintertime unless they really need it.
Hmm.
It basically varies from animal to animal. And it just really helps them. I find that it helps them dial in. I've had people question like, well, why do you cool them off? So why do you fast them for so long in the winter? I'm like, this whole thing that, particularly with carpets, that they're like, even as babies, that they're fragile. They have to be handled with kids' gloves in a sense. Like, it's just better just to rip off the band and just let them get used to it. By the time they're adults, they're going to be very dialed into the room, and they're going to behave very predictably, and it's going to be very easy to get them breeding, in my
Yeah.
opinion. Just with what I've noticed in this room, in both rooms, same thing with the diamonds. The way I have those set up is that during this time of year, they'll get like maybe 10 hours of heat, and then in the winter time, the amount of heat they get is less. So it'll probably be like maybe 6 or 7. I don't adjust the thermostat temperatures itself because I'm the type of person that will forget. So I don't
Hmm.
touch any of the temperature settings on that. But I'll just, if with the diamonds, I'll just switch up how long they get it for. And with the lighting, the lights turn on at sunrise and turn off at sunset. Um, my personal dealing with that is that it kind of mimics sunrise and sunset, and I think it helps my animals realize like temperature cues. Like, I think that's why this winter, like, these guys like really like honed in, and just like it's like they can predict the weather before I can.
Mm.
um so that seems to work. Like, in a few weeks I would expect my animals to start behaving the way that I would expect them to behave during like a summer food cycle type of thing. So
Okay.
looking at my diamond, she's starting to do that now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I have a female diamond. If I were to feed her every day, she probably would eat every day. But those things, and even in, like, when it's cold, like I've come into this room when it's middle of winter in the daytime, where the room is just starting to warm up, and she's out and about, like just in ambush position. I'm like, yeah, no, we're not feeding you right now. So
Yeah. That's the way one of my pop ones is. He's always out looking for food. It's ridiculous. And it's like, you're a boy, you don't need to eat. You're not
yeah, I just moved out
sorry.
my last pop one. There, I can appreciate them, but I'm getting to that point where I'm just like honing in, and I'm gonna phase it. Like, my jungles are all gonna get the boot. So
Mm.
yeah, it's just, I like my coastals, I like the diamonds. I have two pet mutts that are like my OG carpets,
Hmm.
and I just can't find. If someone wants them, I'll probably like, yeah, sure, if you want a pet, sure, but like, I'm not gonna breed them. They're mutts. But I have like no real plans with them, so they're just kind of just like kicking around and just taking up cage space.
Yeah, that's how I kind of am with my pop one. I really like him. But I think I got him thinking this will be a good start to a project and I'll start getting females and another male, and then I got into the jungles, and now I'm like, nah, I think I'm gonna just keep getting jungles. And so yeah, I don't think he's gonna be hanging out in the house too much longer. What
Yeah.
how do you track humidity? Do you keep an eye on that? Do you mist? Do you
I I don't miss. So honestly, I'm on the thought of, I just provide fresh water, and I encourage them to drink by giving them fresh water frequently.
Mhm.
I don't chase my parameters the way I always compare this to people who keep fish. Like, people constantly like track their pH and stuff like that. I don't do any of that. And in terms like the reptile thing, I don't keep track of the humidity. I don't worry about it. As long as they're shedding and it's all in one piece, then I'm assuming it's fine. I don't actually I don't aim for a specific number. Now, with that being said, the room does range between maybe 30 and 65, depending on the time of year. 30 in the winter time, if it's really, but also that's the room itself. The cages are probably going to be a little bit more humid just because the way the cages are. So, but I don't worry about that sort of thing, to be honest. I don't fret over it. I don't miss my animals. I feel like keeping something too wet is going to be more detrimental than keeping it a little dry.
Mhm.
Just because if you're going to miss something, it should dry up very relatively quickly, like within a few hours. I think
Mhm.
people run into issues if it sits there and it's like constantly wet, or if it gets cold and wet, then it's an even bigger problem. Which is why, if I have to, the only time I'll clean something in the winter time is if like a cage gets wet, and that's for I don't want them getting cold and wet, since my room gets pretty cold at nighttime in the wintertime. So
Is that where you experience a lot of RIs come from? Is cold and wet?
I think it's an easy way for an RI to manifest itself. I think part of it, and I think people freak out about this. I think what happens is that when they're kind of like with us, like we get stressed and sick, we're gonna get sick.
Hmm.
If it's something that's bacterial with these guys, they're gonna naturally have the bacteria already. It's just that their immune response is weakened, and whatever bacteria they're carrying is gonna just grab a foothold and it's gonna run wild. With snakes and RIs, if it's bacteria, it's usually some sort of like Pseudomonas. But I think keeping it things properly, like don't let it get too wet in the wintertime. You're gonna be fine. I do let my stuff get cold. I know some people worry about it because of if there's anything latent and they start bubbling at the nose. But I've swabbed my animals often. I've swabbed them for viral stuff often enough that I don't worry about that. But I also, with the way I treat my collection, if I swab something, I don't. I'm very reluctant to call it like NIDO free. It just means that they're not shedding the virus at that time. I think that's
Mm.
an entirely different conversation. I just think there's limitations with the test itself, but that's just how I deal with it. But with the swabs that the results that I've gotten, I don't worry about keeping them a little cooler.
Hmm.
This winter, I've learned the hard way that I have to keep them a little cooler because my furnace decided to break down.
Mm.
So everyone got cooled down whether I wanted to or not, including myself. But yeah, I just
What
as
kind
long
of
I think
temperatures were you experiencing with the furnace out?
oof. So with the furnace out, without I just walked into the room and I saw it at like 66, 67. And I kept getting alarms on my phone like that the target temperature isn't being reached. And like, wait, what the heck is going on here? And I
Yeah.
learned that a 30-year furnace that I've had like decided to crap out on me like the end of November. So like, all right, cool, awesome. So
Yeah.
with the price that I was quoted, I'm like, all right, we're just gonna have to like use space heaters this year. Um, so that's what I did. But honestly, what I've learned is that these guys really fare better. It's better to keep them cooler than it is to keep. You're gonna have less issues keeping them cooler than you're gonna have keeping them warmer.
How
Um,
so?
I feel like, for example, I'm gonna use Jags as an example because it's the perfect little neuro thing. People who I've noticed that Jags that jag out, so to speak, tend to really jag out with warmer temperatures. Um,
I mean, with your background and everything, and if somebody's listening and they're not familiar with Jags, can you just explain Jags and their neural issues that they have?
Sure. So with Jags, they tend to. So I'm going to compare Jags and spiders are basic. Spiders with ball pythons are basically the same type of mutation, and it causes a. I'm going to call it like ataxia, like unbalanced coordination. It seems to be animal specific, and it seems to be if they're stressed out, it's going to manifest. It's going to be really apparent. Some animals, I've noticed that it's really subtle, almost to the point where people think that they don't have any neuro. But if you watch it carefully, they're kind of just a little uneasy, like they're in ambush position. You kind of see that they're a little wavy versus an animal that does not have jag, where it's just straight and just like ready to take off. Um, it seems to be responsive to stress, whether it's stress from feeding, stress from handling. When I say stress, like excitement stress, like from feeding, or even something like breeding.
Mm.
So there's a male jag in a collection at this moment who I would notice it if he's very like riled up and just pacing in his cage just because he knows that there's females nearby who are ready to breed. But I find that definitely keeping animals cooler helps. These guys, the Jags, I tend to keep them a little bit lower on the stack of cages just to keep them a little cooler. But I've had someone visit my collection recently and they made one of the comments like, your Jags don't look very jaggy. I'm like, no, I guess because I don't stress out my animals. Now, whether or not it's like one of these ethical things of breeding versus not breeding I don't treat my Jags any different than I treat my other animals. I feel like they compensate well, they don't know they have these issues. They don't know that they're Jags. But
Hmm.
I've also not really had a Jag in the collection that does something weird, like sitting with its head upside down. So the ones in the collection, it's very minor, and that's if I see, and that's like it's usually like with food, and it's like if they're just like a little on the wild, like they're a little, you can see they're a little uneasy, as they're like in perched, like ambush position. But that's about the extent that I've seen it. Now I've
Hmm.
seen other people's Jags like really jag out, but I guess it's just like, fortunately, I haven't had that issue yet. I'm sure I will at some point, but I haven't had any issues with that. But I don't treat them any different than my other carpets. Like some people are
Okay.
like, oh, give them shelves, don't give them perching. Mine have perching. Mine are fine. I have a female Azanthic Jag who I will let her maternally incubate a clutch as long as she's doing it properly. I think these animals compensate, and I know people who have actually let their Jags maternally incubate and they're fine. So
Okay. And so you've noticed that keeping them at lower temperatures seems to help with that issue?
it definitely helps a lot. I feel like one of the issues so I feel like one of the issues, and I've seen it with a spider ball python, where someone was keeping it a little warmer, where he would actually like really become, well, in his case, like he would spider out, and he would sit like he would do that whole type of thing,
Corkscrew and
and yeah, the corkscrew, and it's just like but then when I learned what his temperatures was, like they were keeping with a hot spot of like 92, 93,
mm,
and I just I'm like, maybe just dial it down just a tad, and it seemed to help out a lot.
hmm.
Stress from handling can kind of make it manifest itself, especially if it's an animal who doesn't get handled routinely. But again, like I'm not. I know there's some people like, oh, if you handle them more often, they're gonna chill out. Like, no, well, also again, they're snakes and not dogs and cats. Like, if I want something I'm gonna handle frequently, I'm not gonna use like one of my snakes for that. Like, that's not the reason why I have them. So,
Hmm.
but it's how that's just my approach to it. I generally just keep the entire collection a little cooler than what other people probably do. And I'll probably say I can probably go a little lower, like keeping it like maybe 85 or so, and I'll probably still be fine. But I think people in general, like reptile keepers, we generally keep things too warm without really understanding, like, because a piece of paper told us to, our care guide told us to do so, without realizing that these guys are like, yeah, like, they're probably going to be out and about when it's cold. Like, well, put a pin on that. If they're out and about, it's going to be because they're cooler, like, not because it's too hot. But
Mm.
I just can't. I don't know. I don't feel right keeping them at warm. Even my fish that I keep, like my so-called tropical fish, I keep them at a little bit of a colder temperature. I'll keep them at lower ends of like what their range would be. I just think keeping things too hot, it's not ideal. I'm just going to speed up their metabolism anyway. That's
Okay.
my approach to it.
How often do you change water?
So on a perfect week, I'll change it like 3 times a week just to encourage them to drink. Um, I'm a very big stickler for fresh water. If for some reason someone, I don't know why, I guess because the way the sky hides is set up, someone every once in a while decided like shit in their water bowl, I'll change that out very frequently. But otherwise, it'll be 3 times a week. I've done it twice a week if it's like a really hectic day and I get home and it's like lights already off. I have a rule like really don't mess with these animals once lights are off.
Hmm.
Then I was kind of like, all right, cool. I'll do, I'll, as long as the water is okay, like they have water and it's not like soiled, I'll let it sit for an extra day. But I try to aim for, generally speaking, 3 times a week. I've noticed that every time I put fresh water in their cages, they're always drinking.
Mm.
They'll come out and I always find them drinking. Some drink more than others, but I can definitely see them drinking the fresh water. Whereas I think if the water sits there a little longer, they'll probably drink it if they need to. But I feel like that fresh water just really encourages them to drink. And I think that's why I have no issues with the shedding. And that's, I just don't want to actually like chase my parameters that way. So I just give them fresh water. I think carpets are the species that you can actually get away with that. More species than that, like I think boas are the same exact way because I do the same thing with my boas, but I don't I don't miss anything, and I don't.
So are you just like what's your process for changing out the water 3 times a week? Are you sanitizing the bowls all 3 times, or are you
No,
doing the disposable deli
that's
cup
actually a very
method?
good question. So what I'll do is I'll dump the water, give fresh water. So what I'll do is I have what I call my dirty hand and my clean hand. My clean basically, well, actually, let me backtrack because it's like if I'm cleaning cages. So if I'm changing out water, I'll go and I'll just dump everything out, give everybody fresh water. So dump everyone's water bowls out. If something is soiled, that water bowl is getting swapped out entirely. And I do keep an extra stash of like 32-ounce water bowls in the cage for the cages, and that water bowl gets swapped out. So now once a week, what I'll do is everything gets taken out, and I'll soak it in either bleach, a dilute bleach, or an accelerated hydrogen peroxide solution like rescue. It's like something that they use in veterinary clinics. And after that soaks and that gets cleaned out properly, then I'll run that stuff through the dishwasher. And the whole idea is that I expose it to high temperatures to kind of
Mhm.
sanitize everything. Um, and that's how I'll do with everything. With the stuff in the racks, for the most part, everyone's on like disposable plastic cups, and those guys don't. Once a week, it gets swapped out, but nothing gets like those things don't get washed. It all gets dumped and replaced. And that's just more for like efficiency purposes than anything else. But that's just my approach to it. Um, I find that if you leave your water bowls sitting there and you're sitting in the cage for too long, you'll see that film. If you ever run your fingers
Oh
on the
yeah.
water bowls, you can get that like that biofilm. I really try to avoid that, and that's why like, I'll just soak everything and scrub everything down. Just because you can't really clean everything, and that biofilm is like just sitting on there. That's just my approach to it. Different people do different things, but it's just how I deal with it. Um, and it works out for the most part. Now, everything in the wintertime, I'll probably back off just ever so slightly, just because I don't want to disturb breeding animals. As long as things look fine, I might let it go. I might do it twice a week, but I really just try not to mess with the animals during the wintertime, especially if they're breeding.
Okay, so ideal world, you're doing, and what do you? I'm sorry, maybe you said this and I totally missed it. Are you like going around with like a bucket and you just dump all the dirty water into the bucket, and then you've just got fresh water that you're pouring in there, and that's twice a week, and then on the third you're doing the full
Correct.
sanitize.
Yeah, so I have like those Home Depot, but like those famous Home Depot buckets that like orange. I'll dump everything in that. That gets dumped out. Fresh water. I have like one, just like a water pitcher that just basically I'll fill up the water, and I'll do that twice a week. And then like on my day off, it's either going to be a Saturday or Sunday. I'll take everything out, soak it, clean it out properly. Then everyone gets clean water, and that's like my maintenance days.
Yeah.
So that's how I'll deal with that. And I'll do that on the weekends. Um, that's why another reason why I watch how many animals I have. If it takes me longer than 2.5 hours to do everything I have to do, then stuff needs to move out. I find that that's my cap.
I know it's so crazy when I hear about guys that have like 200 or 400 snakes, and I'm like, how do you do it? Because I have a tiny collection. I've got a dozen animals, and for me, it's like 20 minutes a day. You I don't have like a cleaning day. It's probably 15 or 20 minutes per day that I go in and I'm just like, oh, there's urates, there's a stool, spot clean it out, get down to dry bedding, and then, waters and feeding, and yeah, it's a lot of time.
Yeah, and my collection is small. I say like my collection is small compared to other people. Like I still, even with everything that's hatched out this year, there's still less than 100 animals, and I tend to keep it that way. But it's very. I've learned yesterday because I'm doing feeding trials, and some of these guys like this takes time,
Hmm.
and I've learned this. I'm like, you know what? And I've learned over time that anything that takes me longer than 2.5 hours, I'm like, all right, do I really want to do this? Or, I'll handle it in such a way that it takes me 2.5 hours tops. But I think once things start becoming a chore, and I say that I've not had that happen yet, but once things start becoming like a chore, and I think that that's when people need to really rethink these things, because then like that's when it's very easy for things to start slipping through the cracks. Um, and I try, and the reason why we get into these hobbies, it's a hobby. It should always feel like a hobby. It should never feel like a chore.
Yeah.
So if the second you're like, we all have moments where it's like, oh man, I got to do this. All right, cool. I remember one time I had cellulitis on my leg and I couldn't walk on that leg. I was actually hospitalized for like an entire day because of it, and I had to limp my ass into the room
Oh wow.
and do things like practically like on one leg because they actually still needed the care.
Yeah.
So, and I've had the flu, and I'm like, I felt crappy, and I'm like, okay, like these guys need care. Like, as long as you're able to provide the care, like it's like it's if you have a large collection, it becomes even more of a hassle. But also, I think one of the reasons why I don't have a larger collection because of space. My
Hmm.
snake room is only about like 10 by 13 feet, and it
Hmm.
seems like a lot, but when you have 4 foot caging, you really lose that space very quickly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Trust me. I feel you. Yeah. So that I want to, at some point, I want to go back to the feeding trials. We definitely got to talk about that.
Yeah.
But do you provide a water bowl big enough for your animals to soak in, or is it not a
I
concern?
I do, but it's not. So they have water bowls that are big enough for them to soak in, but I don't give it to them so they can soak in. So basically, these water bowls are like 32-ounce water bowls. They're like the plastic ones that you see at like Chewy and stuff like that. I just happen to have lucked out, and I can get these from like the dollar store nearby. So I
Mm,
get those water bowls for my adults, and it's just economical and it works that way. These guys, I have either plastic water bowls or I have like the stainless steel ones. It depends what the dollar store has that day. And if I find that they have a lot of them, I end up buying a bunch of them just so that way with the water bowls, I use these for my dogs as well. Where I like to be able to swap out the water bowl and have enough extras so I don't have to like get stuck in a situation like, oh man, I have to really clean these water bowls because I have no water bowls for this, for this particular animal. So I like
yeah.
to keep at least the amount of water bowls that I have for the animals I have. I have right now there's 15 cages, so I have at least 15 water bowls, and I'll have like a few extras for them as well as the dogs. I do the same thing with the dogs. They don't have like their water bowls get swapped out like every couple of days for the same exact reasons, if not more frequently, because they're dogs and they dirty their water bowls very quickly.
Oh, yeah. It's
So
ridiculous. How do you feel about UVB? Do you give UVB to any of your snakes?
I don't. It's well, I had there was a UVB in my diamond python's cage, but whether or not that's actually providing UVB is an entirely different question because it's been over a year and I haven't swapped out our bowl. But honestly, for what it's worth, I haven't seen any major difference between the animals that I've given UVB to or the animals that don't have it. I do think giving them lighting is very beneficial, but I don't think it necessarily has to be UVB, not for the species that I'm keeping anyway, because I think they're getting everything they need from their food source. So like the calcium, vitamin D. So I think they're getting everything from like whole prey.
Yeah.
So I don't give.
What so what size enclosures are your adult animals going into?
My adult animals are going into 4 foot by 2 feet by I think it's 16 inches. They're the T10s from Animal Plastics.
Okay.
I know people like to give them more height. In a perfect world, I would too, but just because of what my ceiling's only 7 feet, and I like my cage to match. Like I don't like having different cages. It makes my eyes twitch if the cages don't match. So the first set of cages I got were T10s. I just happened to go that route. Now, with that being said, I think what people put into their cages is equally important, if not more important, because I've seen people use. There was someone who used like 3 foot high caging, but the middle of the cage is bare. Like,
Hmm.
okay, cool, you're giving them all this height, but what can they really use in this space?
Hmm.
Maybe it's a New York mentality. I'm used to like maximizing space. So the way I handle these cages is that I give them a nest box, which acts as a shelf, and then they have the PVC perching, and they have the light. So they're able to get off the ground, they're able to perch out, and they have the sky high instead of just 4-inch corrugated drain pipes that they
Hmm.
freaking love, and I
Yeah.
just give them options that way. I mimic the same thing in my tubs because people are like, oh, but I don't understand why people keep their animals in tubs. Like, yeah, but it's the same. Whatever they have in their adult cages, they have in their tubs. It's just a smaller scale. So they have perching, they have a shelf because they'll perch on the top of their hides, and that acts as a shelf. And then I use the corrugated drain pipes and the 32 quarts that I have. So because they don't fit in the
Okay.
other cages, in the other tubs rather.
So what age are they going into these 4x2 cages? When do they
So I
graduate?
learned, so probably nothing younger than 3 years. And the reason for that is because I have sliding glass doors in my caging. It's just, I know people use swing acrylic doors. I don't like acrylic. I personally don't, I've never liked the look of it. It scratches, it warps, it looks funky over time. So
Hmm.
I use that, but there's a little space in between the glass doors and I guess like the little lip of the cage. And if the animal is too small, they can potentially get themselves stuck in that, and that can be an even bigger problem. So I've done 2-year-olds in those cages. Like I've kept 2-year-olds in those cages, but it seems to work out for them. But I've learned that anything over like as long as they're 3 years, anything 2.5, 3 years old, I start moving them into adult caging. I maybe a little sooner for my females if they're at that size. I'm like, way they can benefit from the extra space, but I don't have a set rule. Like, oh, okay, you just hit 3, so you have to be in this cage. It's basically once they're getting closer to breeding and stuff like that, I have some of my projects planned out years in advance already. Once I know that they're going to breed, I'll kind of move them into their caging a little earlier on than maybe someone who I'm not quite as sure as how I'm going to use them. Whereas, let me rephrase that. Where when I'm going to breed them, rather, because I know I'm going to breed them, I just don't know when. Then I'll kind of like let them sit in the tub. But it all depends on like, okay, what cage space do I have available? I'm in a weird spot right now. I'm still kind of moving animals out
Mm.
that are not like animals that I'm going like my last pop one moved out recently. I was trying to just breed her, just like check that box off, but I don't know. She didn't breed, so she ribs off. So I'm like, okay, cool, out the door you go, because I'm not
Yeah.
passionate about that subspecies. Like they're pretty, but I try not to keep things that are repetitive. Like if enough people are keeping pop ones, I'm not going to keep them. I
Yeah.
try not to copy people's projects.
Yeah. There's a lot of pop one projects out there right now because, I mean, you can still import them. There's a lot of potential there. So it's understandable.
It's refreshing. I remember when I first got into carpets, and they were still like being looked at as the brown dirt snake, and they were
Hmm.
like dirt. I remember the first, like I remember seeing like they would go for like 150, 175, and now it's like they've more than doubled in price. And it's nice to see that they're getting the love that they're getting because I've seen some really nice pop
Oh,
ones,
yeah.
and they're really stunning. But they don't. I don't know. They just don't do it for me. Coastal what makes me happy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's some wild colors and mutations going on there.
Yeah, my reds are very near and dear to me.
Yeah,
So
but what kind of food items are you feeding? Chicks, quail, mice, rats?
so I do rotate everything. So my little guys, my hatchings, I'm starting them off on. I'm actually starting those guys off on hoppers or fuzzies, depending on the size. I've noticed that my maternally incubated clutches are double, if not triple, the size of the stuff that was incubated
Hmm.
artificially. So those they haven't shut out yet, but those guys get started on hoppers because they're very well big enough to take hoppers. Now some of my little guys, or if it's a stressful animal, they'll start on fuzzies. But like I rotate everything. I probably won't rotate as many things like the first year with something like a jungle because I've learned over time that if I'm gonna have a fussy feeder, it's usually like a young yearling jungle. But honestly, with the way I food cycle in the wintertime, they tend to grow out of that very quickly. So the point where they're just going to eat whatever I give them when I feed them, when food is actually available to them, like in the spring and summer. So
Mm.
I don't stress out if something doesn't eat when it's young.
Do you recommend to new keepers, or if somebody's like brand new and they're listening to this, to not stress out about the snake not eating, and maybe you could elaborate on, even with your experience, in the clinic and or the hospital, when snakes do go off food and the reason why.
I think I think people over worry, and it's especially with something like a carpet python. They make a mountain out of a molehill of a situation. If they don't eat, fine. As long as they're not losing muscle, like losing body condition. It's very rare that they do. Maybe like a breeding male whose mind is on everything else but food. But they lose very little weight if they're off feed. And I think people just get into the habit, where people get into the bad habit, or rather, just like feeding things too frequently. How many times we've all seen like people feeding their animal once a week? And I'm like, I don't feed my hatchlings once a week. I'll probably go, as the most frequent I'll feed them is like every 10, 11 days. But
Mhm.
I don't overfeed. And I think some of the issues that I think there's a few things going on. Number one, the animal just may not be hungry because the animal just may be still working on the meal that it got 7 days ago. It's like, how many times have we eaten? And they're like, oh, you know what? I'm not that hungry. I'm not going to finish this. It's like, it's kind of the same thing with them. So I feel like people feed them less. They tend to have, or if they kind of like cycle them in the winter time, the way I think they benefit from, I think they're not going to have these issues. But again, I think people are just overfeeding. But honestly, don't worry about them not feeding. I had my Savu gave me a real big headache when I had her quarantined. She probably ate for me 3 times in 3 months, but in
Mm.
her case, it wasn't husbandry related. It was the location of where that quarantine rack is at, which is right, like as I'm going upstairs, it's like right at near the stairwell. And my dogs, their witching hour, they love to run up and down those stairs. And Liasis seemed to be a very nervous, like she was a very nervous animal to begin with. So she was giving me some issues with feeding. But once she cleared quarantine and she ate, she moved into the main room. She was eating way more reliably, to the point where she was just like always on food mode. And even then, I still didn't feed her more than like maybe every 10, 12, depending on what I was feeding her. Once she moved up to hoppers, I fed her a little bit less, but generally speaking, as long as you're not like feeding something like pinkies or like something that's like mostly water, then you're going to be fine to feed them more sparingly than that. But I think every 7 days is just way too much for any animal.
Yeah.
So that's even for the babies. I know some people, especially if you're going to feed in the wintertime. I personally do not, but I think 7 days is just way too frequently for most of these species, unless it's like a colubrid where they need to be fed frequently. Most pythons don't require that frequent of a feeding.
Are most of your customers experienced snake keepers that are looking for something to add to their project, or do you get a lot of customers that are looking for a pet snake?
That's a good question. So a lot of the times I've had, as of late, the snakes that have been made available have all been snatched up by people who know me, or people that have mentioned, like, I guess like people who are somewhat familiar with me. But I haven't had any like randomized people do that. I have
Mhm.
had random people do it, like reach out to me over snake. But what I'm noticing as of late, that whatever's been moved out has all been moving to people who already know me, and they're like mostly people who already have carpet pythons, so, or they're getting into certain projects.
Mhm.
Um, what I'm noticing as of late, and I'm actually really happy for it, that red coastals are getting more love and more traction. So I've had people reaching out and asking about them, especially with the guys that hatched out recently. But um, just that's usually how it turns out. Like, yeah, like there's always going to be like a few random people like reaching out to me on Morph Market or whatnot. But I'm also doing something where I'm trying not to really use these third party platforms to move stuff. I'm actually in the process of like having a website made so I don't have to rely on them. So
Nice.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Um, Feeding trials. How does that work? How does it work getting babies started?
So these guys, they're just starting now. So I know people tease feed. For some reason, the animals that I've this year, the babies that are hatched out, they're not taking tease fed. Like I'm not tease feeding isn't working for me. Drop
Can
feeding.
you can you walk
Um,
me through what tease feeding is?
sure. So tease feeding is you'll have like a food item on a forceps, a tongue, so whatever you want to call them. And you're basically just like you know pissing off the animal to eat it. So basically, like you'll kind of poke them like on the neck with it, and that usually elicits a bite response.
Hmm.
Um, but what I'm noticing with my guys that I have a lot of runners where if I try to tease feed them, they're gonna stress and they're gonna zip to the other side of the tub.
Hmm.
So what I've been doing with these guys, I'll feed them as late as possible. Like I've been feeding these guys literally before I go to sleep, just dropping it, dropping a food item into the tub, and just checking on them in the morning. I just fed like 6 of my jungles last night, and 5 of those 6 actually took their, they took their first meals that way. But this year I've not had, I've tease fed like animals that have come to me that were supposedly finicky feeders and they've taken off really well. Like you would never think that they were a problem feeder, but I seen that these guys that I've hatched out, they seem to be doing better with the drop feeding. Where I'm just dropping
Interesting.
item, just checking them in the morning. Emphasis on checking on them in the morning because it's very easy to get distracted and forget about it. And if you walk into that room, you get a smell like, wait a second, someone didn't eat their food. So I try to make it a point to check that thing first thing in the morning before it gets to that.
So after a snake hatches, how long is it before you start doing the feeding trials and offering them their first meal?
The way I've been doing it this year, I let everything hatch out. I wait until they shed, and it's usually it seems like 2 weeks seems to be what I'm having luck with. So I'll go and once I see that they're out and about, like they'll kind of fall into the rhythm of the room where I see them out at lights out, whereas they're when I first put them in, sometimes it takes them a few days where they're just kind of like always hiding. Once I start seeing them in ambush position, like they're on the poultry fence and they're basically like ready to eat, I'll feed them. Um, and I'll just drop feed them. I'll just drop the food item, walk away, check it in the morning. But I will get that food item as warm as possible as I can, because I'm expecting them to not go for it right away. And
Hmm.
it seems that that way of doing things seems to be what works for me. We're going to see what happens with the maternally incubated clutches that hatched out. Once they shed out, maybe they might be better with actually being tease fed. But I'm probably going to wait nothing less than 2 weeks. I feel like when I've done a week after week or anything less after shedding, they're just gonna run. They're gonna be too stressed out for it, and I don't want to stress them out. I try to keep them as
Interesting.
low stress as possible at that age.
And when you do the drop feeding, I mean, I don't know if you've witnessed it or had a camera on them. Are they going up to it and biting and wrapping, or are they just going up to it and nosing it and then eating it?
So what I've noticed that they're going to it, just nosing it and eating it. I've had a few of them go up to it and kind of like once they figure out to kind of like half-assed wrap around it and just take
Yeah.
it that way. But it's interesting because I've really not had. This is like the first time I've actually like really had to drop feed animals. Because usually I just bite and wrap, but these guys, it seems they'll half-assed wrap it. So I don't know if it's because these guys would just they were cooking in an incubator or what, or maybe they're just a little bit smaller. I don't know what it is, but that's just what I've noticed that they do. They'll just bite and they'll just start kind of like once they figure out it's food, they figure out they want it, then they'll just kind of like bite it. Or sometimes they'll drag it into the hide and I can't see what they're doing on the camera after that. If their tubs are in a position where I can actually see what's going on. But like I've had one animal, one of the ones that did not eat her food item decided that she's going to drag it into the hide and just leave it there. And I do keep
Hmm.
sphagnum moss in there, so had to get that out really quickly because that can be something that's easily missed and it's going to smell after that.
Yeah, for sure. So now, do your adults, do you just offer them food, they bite and wrap, or do you drop feed your adults as well?
No, my adults are like keyed in and just ready to eat. There's one exception, and it's a Jamaican boa that will not. She's a very high strung animal. She has to be drop fed. I can feed her anything, but it has to be drop fed.
Mm.
I don't know if it's her or just like the species or just her. I can't compare it because I only have a sample size of one animal right now. But she has to be drop fed. My Hispaniolan boas, up until recently, they're a little over 2 years old now. They were also ones that had to be drop fed. But all my other adults, they're ready and cued in and just like ready to eat. Some of my animals, if I walk by the cages a little too quickly, they'll actually strike at the glass. I'm like, all right,
Mm.
cool, like you're ready to eat. Or one of my fat ass animals where I can feed them the night before and they're still striking because they're just ready to eat. I'm like, well, I'm not feeding you again. So everyone for the most part gets fed. They'll bite and wrap. I don't worry about the drop feeding with these guys. So
Nice.
yeah.
All right, man. Well, that's cool. That's a lot of good information, and I appreciate it and all your insight with the medical aspect of things. And how many dogs do you have?
Three Shiba Inu. Not
Yeah.
not not the breed I would have actually. Let me rephrase that. It's a breed I never would have thought I would have owned. They have a very specific reputation in veterinary settings. They have a reputation of being just downright assholes. But I seem to like dogs that are somewhat misunderstood. These guys, they're very well trained, very well behaved for Shiba Inu. Like I don't have some of the quirks. I don't have issues with some of the quirks that the breed tends to have, like with the screaming that they're infamous for. But that's
Mm.
just because I've gotten them as puppies and we've worked through training, positive reinforcement. But like they've learned. When I say the hard way, they learned that the screaming doesn't mean that I'm going to stop. Like with nail trims, they're infamous for doing that sort of thing as puppies, and if they don't learn that, if they're very good at training you, if you're not stern, if you're not like consistent with them. So like one of them was infamous for screaming, just carrying on with nail trims, and I do positive reinforcement, but sometimes there comes a point that sometimes you just have to like get them through that hump and just like cut their nails so they can realize like this isn't the end of the world. You're gonna live. You're gonna be just fine. And then they realize that, and just reward them after, and they're fine. And that's how my dogs are, to the point where when they're actually seen by colleagues, they're like, "Your dogs are an assholes." I'm like, "Yeah, no, I work through it." Also, it's just like I have to be able to do these things with them. Like I don't want to be the person with the dogs like, oh crap, like I can't trim my dog's nails. Like, oh crap, I can't do this. Like or I can't walk my dog this way, or I can't do that. So I just work around them. It's like having kids. Like if you're not gonna let your kids do something as they're older, you're probably not gonna let them get away with it when they're smaller. It's kind of the
Hmm.
same mentality.
Yeah. Can you call one of your dogs over? Are they in the room with you?
They're waiting for me. They're just being bored right now. Like one of them was messing around with his food bowl just to be absolutely annoying. But they're not. Yeah, generally speaking, they're just hanging out doing nothing.
Yeah.
They know the drill. Once I'm sitting in this room or once I'm dealing with the collection, they kind of know that I'm gonna ignore them, so they just don't even bother.
I
Um,
had to put my guy in his crate because he came in here when I was recording last and bumped into the table, bumped into the camera. Just, I mean, but he's like, 85 pounds and just
not
doesn't
realize.
realize. Yeah.
Yeah, these dogs are bigger than I had miniature pinchers before these guys, and they've since passed. And it's like, I never would have thought that I would have gotten this breed. They found their way to me, and they found they're from a breeder, and they're good dogs. I like them. They work for me. I'm not always a fan of like Velcro dogs, just because I can't. I'm not always like I work. My hours are very unpredictable. I need something that's going to be okay and not freaking out when it's left alone.
Hmm.
I'm not a fan of having to bring the dogs into work, and where I'm at right now, it's not an option for many different reasons. There's three of them. They're not small. Beyond other things, I just like, whatever. You're fine. But they're good dogs. They're not for everyone. They're definitely a breed that you have to trick them into learning, and they're not a breed that's like easily willing to please you. They have more of a what's in it for me type of attitude. So
Yeah.
I dare say it's kind of like having cats, but
Yeah, my buddy Drew, he's got one, and they're such cool little dogs though. They seem to have a really neat personality.
they're cool. The shedding sucks, but you
Yeah.
kind of have to you have to frequently clean up, and like my had a RoboVac, and that thing died a miserable death with having the three of them shedding at the same time. So I just sweep and vacuum very frequently just to avoid that. Just
Yeah.
because having dogs in the house is one thing, but I like to make sure that I minimize the tumbleweeds that I'll see with three shedding Shiba Inu in the house.
Yeah.
They will
Can
shed
you
one.
call one up on your lap right now? I want to see one.
They won't jump up on a lap right now, but hang on a second. Oh, they're like knocked out. Hang on a second. Rogie.
There we go.
She's yeah, she was I went with the X-Men thing with these guys. She was put on my lap when she was a puppy. I did not want her in the beginning. I
Yeah.
really wanted having my previous dogs is a whole headache of puppy raising. It wasn't until they put her on my lap and I just fell into it. So I just named her Rogue after it's very X, if you know who Rogue, from the X-Men. So
Oh
I
yeah.
just got sucked into her person and that was it. So these guys were
Nice.
just got their attention. So Rogue, Phoenix, and Bishop. So Rogue's
Nice.
looking this time around. Yeah. So
That's awesome.
they're good dogs. Do I want dogs after this? I don't know. I like snakes are an easy and convenient choice to keep.
Yeah.
So they're just like you have to walk them, you have to feed them frequently. I think the headache, good girl. I think the headache that comes in is like having to travel. And unless I have someone staying at the house, it's not always the best. I'm not a fan of boarding them.
Yeah.
Just because I know how I handle my dogs. No one's gonna, whether they're well meaning or not, no one's gonna ever take care of your own pets the way you do.
Yeah.
So that's just my whole thing. So
Thank God for Rover though. It's a little bit easier now. I feel like to find somebody that, is good.
it works. It doesn't work for my dogs. My dogs are not that type of dog. They
Yeah.
will, if someone comes in uninvited, they will sink their teeth into their thigh. I have not had that happen, but there are definitely fuck around, find out dogs. One of my friends walked in unannounced and nearly had to pry Rogue off his thigh. So I had before that got to that point. But once if I invite someone in, they'll bark, they'll do their thing, but then they just get over it quickly. But
Yeah.
I'm in the process of training the other half to walk them, so that way I don't have to deal with it in the event I have to travel, whatnot. But these dogs they're very good watchdogs. They're not the type of dog that can just have random strangers coming in and just leashing them and walk them.
Yeah. Yeah. Our dog's the opposite. When the Amazon guy comes, he'll walk out and lean on his leg.
No, there's one that they like. It's like the normal person, the normal delivery guy. But these guys are just if it's someone new, if it's if every once in a while they have a maintenance person in the hallway, cleaning the hallways. If it's a new person, I can tell if it's a new person just if they're barking. Right now, they just went nuts. It's probably a new person in the hallways that's maintaining the hallways. So, but once they're familiar, they're just okay, cool. I don't know you, but I'm familiar with you. I'm not gonna freak out about it. But they take their watchdog duties very seriously.
Yeah.
So.
What's your favorite snake of all time? It doesn't have to be something that that you can keep. It could be something that you could never have.
Favorite is going to be a carpet python. I will say that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say coastal carpet python. They're perfect. They're not massive. They're impressive and manageable. They display beautifully. They don't have some of the feeding issues that some of the other species have. They're not nearly as bad reputation-wise. They're not nearly as aggressive as what people say they are. They have a food response that's to be respected.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone's getting a pet for the very first time, I would actually recommend a carpet python over a ball python. I feel like they're a little sturdier, and I've seen more ball pythons crash with incorrect husbandry than with carpet python. So I will say a carpet python. So I
Nice.
might be a little biased because I have them, but they do well. They're just such a hardy animal.
Yeah.
I like them. They're very near and dear to me. Holy shit.
Hell yeah. Spider-Man or Captain America?
That's. I don't know. You know, I'm a huge Marvel fan. I do like Spider-Man. I like both of them equally for different reasons. Like one of them's from Brooklyn, the other one's from Queens. Just that whole New York thing, like being from Brooklyn to being from Queens, just like it's what's appealed to me. That's why you
Yeah.
kind of see that whole
Oh
thing
yeah.
going on. But I would say both of them equally, but for very different reasons.
Yeah.
So
The
yeah.
new Spider-Verse movies are so epic. I'm so happy it happened.
Yeah, I was upset with it. I loved it, but I was upset that I was left hanging at the edge of my seat.
Oh yeah,
Like,
with the
damn it!
latest one, I know. I know. It's like, what? You can't do that.
Yeah,
Especially since you know it's going to be like 4 years until we get another one.
yeah. They're like, oh yeah, it's gonna be next year. I'm like, bullshit, man. They
Yeah,
always
with the
make you
writers
wait.
strike and yeah,
Yeah,
forget about it.
exactly. Now it's like this year. Now that Marvel's been kind of Disneyed up, it's not the same. But we'll see how the next Deadpool movie pans out. I'm really looking forward to this one, but it's
Oh yeah.
also the only Marvel movie that we have to look forward to this year. So
I know. But man, it's a good one. Holy cow. We got Hugh Jackman back in the yellow and blue and yeah.
yeah, it's sort of yeah. I hope it's nice to see that it's not that they didn't Disney up Deadpool, but I was also a fan of Deadpool before he became more popular.
Yeah.
So, because I felt like a lot of people weren't as familiar with Deadpool until after the Deadpool movie.
Yeah.
So,
I want to see a Hulk versus Wolverine movie or something. I want to see it done. I would love to see that.
yeah, it would be cool. So my gripe lately with some of the it is Disney because Marvel's owned by Disney. Some of these movies just like it's okay. Like my biggest complaint right now, and my friends had to sit and listen to me, like with the third Guardians of the Galaxy. I hate the way they designed Groot. Like they
Mm,
made I really don't like the way it looks like a cheap costume, and
yeah.
it really just looks like that. But whatever. A lot of these movies are, being that it's Disney now, it's gonna have to deal with it. But you know, it is something to pass the time.
Yeah. Take what you can get. It's better than
Exactly.
nothing. It's a great time to be a nerd.
Exactly. And I'm definitely more in case you haven't figured out, definitely Team Marvel versus DC.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, brother. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on and talking about all the things we talked about today.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me on, Adam.
Absolutely.